Okay, welcome to mini lecture 5 in module 3. In this series of lectures, we're going to talk a little bit about the human context in the Americas, and we're going to begin with the pre-Columbian period, look a little bit at where the populations were, their characteristics, and then of course the Columbian context with the advent of European colonization. Next lecture we'll be talking a little bit about the decolonization period, and then we will be introducing our topics for discussion. I do want to make a point here. I am not going to go over all of the material in textbook. It doesn't serve much of a purpose. If you're going to read the textbook, that's what you should be doing. However, I do want to point out you should have read pages 84 through 105 and 105 through 130 for the quiz. The parts that I'm not going to cover to any great degree are going to be the discussions of urbanization, wealth and poverty, but I will be discussing, in fact I'm going to be giving you a reading assignment outside of the textbook on factors of migration, and I'm going to be giving you a case study associated with Honduras. And so those are the things that I'm going to want you to focus on. What I'm saying here will be for the reading and lecture quiz, but please make sure you have read that content and be ready to answer questions on the basics of urbanization, wealth and poverty, and global interaction. Okay, so let's get into this. First of all, when we talk about pre-Columbian America, that's one of the ways that we can really understand the Americas as a single unified region. There are a number of significant population centers that existed prior to European colonization. In fact, the population within the Americas rivaled that of many of the rest of the parts of the world. The cultures were also diverse and complex, and so we're going to be talking a little bit about that, and then of course we'll get to that Columbian Exchange. Okay, so let's take a look at, in reality now, today, kind of cultural geographers, anthropologists, archaeologists, look at the Americas and see a series of major culture centers. In the north, extreme north, we have the Arctic culture groups, Inuit, the Tiklik, extending out to the Pacific Northwest. And those groups largely associated with sparse populations and use of marine resources. And of course we move into the North American central regions that had a whole slew of rather smaller populations, with the exception of the Mississippi Valley populations, the Cahokia populations. As we move into Mesoamerica, then we see very important and significant populations in terms of the Aztec and Mayan culture groups, earlier the Olmec groups. As we move into South America, then we see both the Amazon groups and the major groups along the Incan complex that existed. Now, again, in your reading, you're going to see some aspects of these, but one of the things that I think people should understand when we look at the Americas is how densely populated most people today think the area was. If we look at the North American region, for example, the range of values, of course, the extreme low done in the early 30s versus as little as perhaps 1 million people. Most people today put the numbers closer to approximately 10 million people in North America, as high as 20 million people in Mexico and Guatemala. Central America, between 10 and 13 million people. In the Incan complex, certainly over 20 million people, and quite possibly as high as 30 to 35 million people. Now, why that is significant? If we add all that up, what we can say is that we had diverse and complex populations well on par with European populations. And at the advent of contact, if we look at just the Mexican population, good data today suggests that within 75 years of European contact, the population in Mexico dropped from 25 million to less than 2 million people. That's a magnitude of genocide that has seldom been seen throughout the world. The same can be said for the United States. If you look at the change in the population, the U.S. population of indigenous peoples, it is likely that in 1500 there were at least 7 million people, and by 1750, a little bit longer period, 250 years, that population had been reduced to 1 million. And so those changes in population, it is hard not to use the term genocide. It is clear that the populations of Americas were decimated, were simply obliterated in so many ways, and so much culture was lost. And yet those cultures persist in some areas. As we move into the colonization period, and as you do your reading, consider how the Mestizo and Amerindian populations throughout Mexico, Central America, and South America retain an important voice in those cultures. In the United States, it's a little bit more problematic to understand and to see the interaction of Native Americans with contemporary culture. It is certainly present, but the forced movements that took place in the United States isolated many of these populations and in fact separated them from the evolving American culture. And so it has only been in the last century that that population, through active means, has become more integrated and more present in the U.S. population. All right, now we do have to talk about this Columbian Exchange. The concept here, and a couple of arguments have been made as to why the decline of the Amerindian populations occurred. One of them certainly is disease, and one of the major aspects of the Columbian Exchange is the introduction of smallpox, measles, and typhus into the Americas, including also influenza. It is likely that these populations had no natural immunity to any of these diseases, and epidemics swept through the region almost unchecked. The other aspect, though, of the Columbian Exchange is the transfer of agricultural technologies between the two regions. And it is important to note how many of the things that we take for granted today came from the North American, especially regions, into Europe. When I made the comment that the North American indigenous groups did not have as strong an impact on culture, I have to clarify that. We see less of that in terms of languages perhaps today, and in terms of large populations in the same way that you will see it in South and Central America. But what we do see is the agricultural technologies of corn, squash, pumpkins, tomatoes, etc., moving into Europe. And so those types, the early influences were very, very strong. So the Columbian Exchange, again, is this movement back and forth of agricultural technologies, animal husbandry, and disease. Okay, that's it for the pre-Columbian and contact period. We'll pick up with decolonization in the next lecture.